So I guess I would start by saying I tend to understand the impact of the virtual on physical space. I tend to look at the impact of the information revolution on international affairs more broadly. And so the way I understand that is I try to hang it on two concepts. I sort of have been thinking about this for the last couple of years. What I think are the two driving forces in international relations right now are transparency and volatility. And so I think the world is becoming more transparent, both generally but also as a norm. It's holding up transparency as a norm, a global norm. And that impacts sort of the physical emergence of virtual tribes, and volatility as well. Volatility is more of a condition rather than a norm, but I also think that it's something that we're growing to expect in international affairs. So if you think about these two things, how are those conditioning the emergence of virtual tribes into physical space? And I try to think in concrete examples, and so the one that I was talking about before with another person here was the example of Chinese nationalists online who, when the internet first started to spread into China, were sort of a niche group, right? And were thought to be carefully cultivated by the government and existed in specific forums, actually. They started on BBSs and then on forum spaces that were basically hosted by the Chinese government, sort of spun up on certain topics that allowed, it sort of allowed the CCP to push certain lines, right? And to
The CCP
kind
is
of,
the
Chinese Communist Party, right? The governing structure
Yeah.
of China.
Got it. Right.
But it's always been tricky for the CCP because Chinese nationalists are not necessarily only loyal to the CCP. They are loyal to an idea of China, and so if they perceive that the CCP is weaker on certain issues than they would like, that anger and discontent may easily manifest itself against the party. So ever since the internet began spreading in China, you've seen this careful management of this online virtual community of Chinese nationalists who can sometimes be spun up and augmented by the government, but can sometimes be controlled and sort of snuffed out when need be, so things don't get too dangerous, or things don't spin out of control. Now, while this is happening, so this starts, basically since the internet starts, spreading through China in a very controlled way. Since that's happened, of course, it's no longer forums. You now have social media with the explosion of all sorts of different kinds of technology in China. What you're now seeing is that these technologies actually allow for much more mobilization. So you actually have that volatility element coming in, where you could use mobile technology, social media to mobilize and flash mob around certain things. And so you had actually very violent anti-Japanese protests 2 years ago in 2012, involving hundreds of thousands, millions of people in China actually, because when a few towns get out and mobilize, that's millions of people right there. Mm-hmm. So that was a very physical and potentially destructive manifestation of a certain online sentiment. But when you start to unpack that, it gets more complicated because we think that the situation seems fairly transparent and straightforward. As we see better who's in this community, we see that it's able to kind of physically manifest itself in certain ways. But what we don't know is the extent to which it's controlled and manipulated by the government. And so I think the idea of transparency can be somewhat misleading sometimes because it leads us to believe that we have a clear picture of what's going on when actually we don't. There are lots of intermediary mediating forces that may condition what we're seeing, and so we may not have a clear picture. We may not directly understand who is this population, this virtual community of nationalists that then kind of spurs this physical protest on the street that can turn violent. It's something that I think we need to study more, and people do study it more, and you see now that there are online conversations that happen around those riots and those protests where there was also a large community protesting that and saying, this does not represent all of China. This doesn't even represent this sliver of people who feel patriotic about their country. So you're getting more complexity into that, and I think that as you get greater transparency around this space, you'll start to see that some of these straight lines, these things that we think follow logically, don't necessarily break down in that way.
Right.
The volatility aspect is more, I think governments around the world are coming to grips with the fact that because of this, this networked information space that we're all in now, right, around the world, the virtual can manifest itself physically very quickly, partly because of the mobilization factor. And so that was one aspect that, again, showed itself in these protests, but you can see it all over the world. You can see it now that people are able to mobilize very quickly, and situations can become very volatile in different ways. But what we don't know is whether that physical manifestation connects itself to specific virtual tribes or not. So I don't know that the idea of virtual tribes really matches up really well with the idea of physical manifestation or protests or so on, because I think they're very fluid, right? And people may mobilize very quickly around a particular cause, but they may not see it through to anything in the end. But I think where these guys, so I think the key question though, and this is why they want to understand how a virtual tribe or a tribe may manifest itself physically, right, is they want to understand how a group of people that mainly communicate online and know each other as a tribe online might then agree to take out, to carry out some act in the physical world. Whether that's a protest, a violent protest, or a violent act, or an act of terrorism, obviously with that being the one of most interest. And that's not something I can answer, the how would you, what is it that causes an online discussion group talking about various things, maybe even encouraging various things. How does that then translate into a very specific physical act? I think there's a valid question there, but it's not something that I don't know that we have the right framework right now for understanding or even asking it. There may be a distinction in their minds about what they're willing to commit to, right? I mean, different levels of participation in a community. One may just be you're just talking with your buddies, right? And you don't care if you're having coffee physically or you're, talking with them online or phone or whatever. And then there's maybe, okay, you collaborate on a project of some kind. Or maybe there's something that requires a little bit more personal risk or risk to, things that you care about. And so I think there's these gradations, and the group sort of self-selects, right? The different parts of that community self-select until finally you come up with, if there are low barriers to entry, you get that physical sort of mobilization of some sort. But again, the physical mobilization, it differs, right? As you say, maybe folks are they just want to goof off, or if it's all it is manifesting yourself physically to go be a flash mob somewhere and dance, it's nothing. If you're doing something that requires a little bit of a physical or political risk, then you may get more barriers to that happening. And obviously, if you're talking about something that is, that involves violence or destruction of property, that has probably the most barriers there. But we don't have a good sense of that chain or that sequence, even if it is a sequence. And that's what I'm not sure we're framing the question correctly, because the way that we frame it reflects a view of technology and virtual spaces as something that's sort of this separate world with its own rules and weird stuff happening. It's a very kind of foreign thing, right?
Yeah, it's interconnected.
And until we change that frame of reference, I'm not sure we'll be able to even formulate the best way to approach that question. So the big question is, in what way could physical manifestation of virtual tribes or virtual communities either help or harm the national security of the United States, right? And so that's sort of the frame of reference. And that's where I think you have to have a better understanding or a better frame for what that space is, and not consider it sort of this separate battlefield, or whatever. That was sort of the terminology that's been used. I don't think that's the right frame for it, and if we think of it as sort of, here's a separate battlefield where there are these rules, and then it will come into the real world somehow. But it's not so separate. It's quite interchangeable. I think law enforcement, national security, all those communities are all trying to figure out the same thing, right? Which is, it used to be you would, if you wanted to infiltrate a certain community, you'd have to spend a lot of time preparing somebody to go undercover. You invest a lot of time and resources. It was incredibly dangerous, right? I think there's a sense now, because again, everybody thinks everything is transparent, right? That somehow it must be easier, because we know what these guys are all about, and I think that's where all of these efforts are. It's made more difficult because there's this assumption of transparency when in fact I think you can still manipulate information. You can still conceal the truth. It's just that it's harder to do, and it requires a greater level of sophistication. And so it's not as easy as saying we're just going to learn everything we can about this online community and maybe get in and talk to them and try and persuade them or stop them from doing X, Y, and Z. It's more complicated than that because it's as complicated as it would be with any virtual, non-virtual tribe. And I think the idea is you can't let go of the fact that this is basically, it is real life. So you have to apply those same metrics.
Yeah.